Good morning. Boy, the lights are bright. I started thinking about this presentation back in the spring when I heard various people discussing variable fonts, variety of questions, concerns, things they weren't sure of, in some cases even understanding what are variable fonts. So I want to try to address some of things this morning. It's exactly 1 year this morning from when I had the privilege of being able to stand in front of the audience at ATypI in Warsaw, together with industry partners, for us to announce OpenType variable fonts. That was an exciting day. And here we are exactly 1 year later, so we get to have a little bit of a celebration, a birthday party. So happy birthday, variable fonts. Now, you've been to parties, you know that at any party, there's people in different moods. Some are more party mood than others, because different people have different things on their mind. And the same thing is true at our variable font party. Different people have different things on their mind, and so I want to talk about some of these things that people may be thinking about. Starting with this guy, who is scratching his head, because he's wondering, what are variable fonts? Just a couple of months ago, I saw this survey that somebody had done trying to get feedback from designers asking, what do you think about variable fonts? And I was struck by the last item there. Over a third of them saying, what are they, right? What are they? So I want to try to address that a little bit. When we announced variable fonts, John Hudson wrote a great blog on Medium giving an introduction to variable fonts, and he gave this succinct characterization, something along the lines of, variable font is a single file that it behaves like multiple fonts. And somebody at Adobe gave a little refinement to that. I'm not sure if it was Dan Radigan or Tim Brown, but they came up with this thing to say that a variable font is a single font that behaves like an entire family of fonts. I think that's a great characterization. But still, some people may wonder, well, what exactly does that mean, though? And how do they actually work? So I want to try to address that, and I'd like to try to give a little visual picture to help you to hang on to things. So as I thought about this, I took a walk down to the local paint store. Now imagine that I've got a wall in my house that I want to paint a shade of orange with some white trim. So I go into the store, and I get some paint, and I come out with 2 cans of paint. I've got a white can of paint for the trim, and then I've got this other can of orange paint. And as I'm walking home, it occurs to me, you know, this can of orange paint, it's really equivalent to the can of white paint plus some tints. Because that's exactly how that was produced in the store. Because in the store, they've got this machine that they do magic with, where they can take some base color of paint, like this base white paint, and a set of tints, and then they've got a formula that they use to pick a certain amount of these different tints that they add to the base white paint. And with that, they are able to produce a wide gamut of different colors of paint. Okay, so I pick out a particular shade of orange, and they dial in the formula, and they mix the paint, and then I go home, and I paint my wall. Now, some years later, I had some water damage, and I need to repaint part of the wall. So I go back into the paint store, and I pick out another shade of orange here, and I bring that can of orange paint home, and I go to paint my wall, and I discover that actually it's not quite the right shade of orange. Because, well, maybe over the years, sunlight has faded the color a little bit. It's not a perfect match, but it's what I've got. It's the best I can do, and so I make do with it. We all know that many times designers make decisions to make do with something, saying it's good enough, and so that's just got to be okay, right? Because they only have so much they can work with. But imagine if, back in the paint store, they could take that white can of paint and that set of tints and this machine that they can use to mix the different tints and put all of that together in one can. So what I go home with is this can that is able to reproduce any of these shades of orange right at the time I want to go and paint. I can pick the exact shade of orange to match my wall at home. That's basically what a variable font is. It's a font that I can take home, and I can choose the exact design instance that I need for a particular application. Inside the variable font, there is, for each glyph, a single outline, not many different outlines. A single outline, and then I've got a set of conceptual ways, or axes, ways in which the design can be altered. And then for each of those different axes, I've got a set of deltas that describe some maximal change to the outline that I can achieve. So different changes that I would use for different axes. And then I've got this ability to dial in a particular formula, picking just the right amount of this axis and this axis to get the particular style variant I want. All of that packed together is what's in a variable font. One last thing, that can of paint could produce a continuous spectrum of colors, but in the paint store, they had particular formulas that they thought were particularly interesting. And those are the things that you get on the chips in the store, and they've got a name. So a name that they gave to that formula. And the same thing happens in the variable font. The font designer can pick out certain formulas in that variable font that they think are interesting and give it a name, what we refer to as a named instance, such as bold condensed. Now, I want to look a little closer at this idea of an outline and deltas. And thanks to Bianca Berning for providing this graphic to me. This is something that she used in a blog and presentation earlier this year. So I've got a lightweight of this capital T, and then a heavyweight. So two different outlines. But if you think about it, just like my can of orange paint was equivalent to the white paint plus some tints, that heavy outline you can think of as being equivalent to the light outline plus a set of deltas that change the outline. Lawrence Penny provided me with this video that gives a nice visualization of the continuous variation that you can achieve. So the dark is showing that the outline, and then the gray is showing the continuous variation, dialing in a certain amount of the deltas, and you can pick any point along the continuum that you want to use. One of the key benefits of variable fonts is that they provide a very efficient representation of data. David Berlow gave me this idea of how to describe this. So go back to this outline of the capital T, and I've got this lightweight. That's 8 contour points. And then if I take the heavy font, I've got another 8 for a total of 16 pieces of data. Let's suppose my family actually has 5 different weights. So now I've got a total of 40 contour points for the capital T across those different weights. But all of those can be represented by one outline plus some deltas. So with this other representation, I only have 8 contour points and then maybe as few as 8 deltas. So a total of 16 pieces of data rather than 40. I just achieved a 60% savings. Or suppose I didn't just have 5 weights, but I also had 3 different widths. Now I've got 15 different fonts in my family. For this capital T, I've got a total of 120 contour points. But again, that can be represented equally by a single outline and a set of deltas that describe how the outline changes for different widths and how the outline changes for different weights. So I go to 8 contour points and then maybe as few as 16 deltas for 24 pieces of data instead of 120. I just achieved an 80% savings. So this is just a representation of how you get a much more efficient representation from a single variable font than you do from a number of equivalent static fonts. But in addition to that, this smaller set of data being able to reproduce those 15 different fonts, I can actually reproduce anything else in between. And so I get a much richer palette that I can work with at the time that I actually want to use the type. So that's a little bit about what they are. Next, I want to talk about this woman who's wondering, are they for real yet? She knows what variable fonts are, and she actually would really like to start using them, but she was at the presentation last year where she heard us say, we've got the spec ready, but everything else is still in process. So she wants to know what's been happening over the last year. How are we close to actually being able to use these things? There's been a fair amount of things that have happened over the past year. So fairly soon after the presentation last fall, we started to see editor drafts for extensions in CSS defining extensions to support variable fonts. That's progressed now to a public working draft as of a few months ago. There's been a number of changes in the spec to accommodate variable fonts, but these two new properties are representative. So font variation settings and font optical sizing. The font variation settings property gives you the ability to dial in that formula, like in the Paint store. You're able to choose any arbitrary instance on any axis that's supported in a given variable font. And then the font optical sizing property is adding the ability in the browser to automatically select a particular optical size variant based on the current text size. So starting to use smart algorithms to make intelligent choices to produce good typography, leveraging a variable font. Fairly soon after we started seeing the spec defined, we started to see support appearing in browsers. So Apple Safari was the first. I think last fall they started having nightly builds that was supporting these extensions. And I understand that any day now they're going to have new OS updates that will be shipping the new version of Safari that are supporting these things. And this spring, Google announced the Canary builds of Chrome, adding support for the font variation settings property. And I haven't confirmed this, but somebody told me that release of Chrome will be coming soon. That's got in October. Yeah. Firefox has done some work on their Mac version. They're looking at doing this for other platforms. And of course, everybody will want to ask me, well, what about Edge? What I can officially say is that this is a high priority item that we are looking at seriously, so stay tuned. Now, in addition to starting to see the CSS extensions defined fairly soon, we also very quickly after ATypI last year started to see type designers starting to experiment, creating prototype fonts to explore what could you do with variations. Then between the combination of having some fonts, having CSS extensions defined, and browsers starting to implement that, that paved the way for Lawrence Penny to put together the Axis Praxis site, which is an excellent resource that he's offered to all of us to be able to explore what you can do with variable fonts through CSS and browser support. So thank you, Lawrence. In the area of tools, there's been a lot of progress on tools. I know even this week, Georg has been working on adding a little more functionality for key aspects of variable fonts. Folks at FontLab have been doing things in FontLab 6, and I particularly want to call out work that's been done in font tools over the past year. Bedad, Cosimo, others have been putting a lot of work into making font tools complete in its ability to support OpenType variable fonts. So you've got a tool path, at least one tool path that you can use to produce the fonts. There have been people talking at various conferences, and I didn't attend many conferences, but I attended the Typo Labs conference. So I'll talk about that. It was a great conference, and I was really excited to see the excitement around variable fonts. Just about every talk touched on variable fonts in some way. If you weren't at the conference and you're interested, all of the talks were recorded and the videos are available online. If you're interested in knowing, is there one talk that I could go and look at to get a pulse of what was going on there, I would recommend Jean-Baptiste Levé's talk. I thought he did a really well-rounded presentation talking about what variable fonts are and what the capabilities they might be able to offer for designers, but then also at the same time, what are challenges that type designers and foundries going to need to work through as they embrace variable fonts? I thought it was great. Another thing that I also found very interesting at the conference was hearing what foundries were doing. So in particular, Dan Radigan from Adobe talked about plans to ship several of the Adobe originals as variable fonts. And we heard from Vinod this morning that they're already doing some preliminary work, getting ready to ship some preliminary stuff with Minion and Myriad and some other fonts. Bob Taylor from OpenType had a really interesting talk where he discussed the workflow that they've been putting together to evaluate their existing families and then the tooling that they're creating to migrate those families into variable fonts where they deem appropriate. Jeff Wu from ARFIC, a foundry in Taiwan, gave a really interesting talk about things that they're doing with variable fonts. So the fonts are coming, so between the browsers coming along, the fonts, like that combination is enough to do a lot. Now, also want to finally talk about stuff that we're doing in Windows. At the conference last year, we mentioned that we were shipping an update of Windows 10 in the fall that had the very preliminary support in the TrueType rasterizer to support interpolating any variations. But the functionality that was fairly constrained because we hadn't changed all the layers on top of that. In the spring, we had another update of Windows 10, and we announced that we had completed in our platforms full support for the OpenType format for variable fonts. So we had full functionality, but constrained by the existing programming interfaces, which meant that you could only access named instances because the ability to select arbitrary instances of a variable font was going to require new APIs. Now, just in a few weeks, we're going to be shipping another update of Windows 10. And in this update, now we've filled out our programming interfaces with new APIs that can be used to access arbitrary instances of variable fonts. And along the way, we're also adopting an ability for applications to get a view of font family in a full typographic sense. Whatever the font designer, whatever kind of style variants a designer considered to be part of that family, the apps can get that view. We also had a great partnership with folks from Adobe to get integration of a CFF2 rasterizer into Windows 10. So at this point, we've got a complete platform for supporting variable fonts. And I think Vinod said that in Photoshop, they were kind of jumping ahead of any operating systems, but I think we'll beat you to the punch of when we actually. we're in a race here. So in addition to the platform support, we are also shipping in Windows 10 our first variable font, the Bandschrift font, which was designed by Aaron Bell based on the DIN 1451 standard. So the DIN design that folks are familiar with, but with variations. In the initial version of the font, it's got a limited character set. We'll be filling that out over time. And it's got one axis. It's got a weight axis. It's a duplexed weight. So as you change the weight values, the horizontal metrics are not changing. We'll also be evaluating for future updates the possibility of adding some additional axes in that. So I think there's been a fair amount of progress over the past year. Let's move on to the next guy at our party who's got some other questions. He understands variable fonts, but he's thinking, well, what about this? What about user interfaces? How do we create good user interfaces for variable fonts? Or what about pricing models? As a foundry, how do we come up with a good value proposition and convince our customers of what the right value is for these fonts? Very important questions. I think a good way to approach these kinds of questions actually is to begin by thinking about the different axes of variation. We've got a set of registered axes that are well-defined, but people are thinking about other axes. I think once we figure out what a good set of axes will be, that will help inform how we think about user interfaces and help think about what kind of value proposition we're offering to font customers. So, as I say, various people have been thinking about this. David Burlow recently published a blog in which he laid out a set of 23 different axes. We saw a presentation earlier that discussed some of these. In his talk at Typo Labs, Jean-Baptiste had a segment in which he listed off a number of axes that he thought were potentially interesting from a typographic perspective. And also, if you were at Typo Labs, you got to hear Akeem and Bas, the guys from Underwear, give this talk where they talked about a super font that they created with 241 axes. And with 241 axes, they could recreate all of the fonts they ever shipped. Now, imagine a user interface with 241 sliders. That would be terrible. But it's important to realize you don't necessarily need sliders for all of the axes. So think about this. This is not my car. But this car has got dozens, if not perhaps a few hundred, independent control variables that are used to tune the performance of that vehicle. Things like the ignition timing, the carburation and turbocharging, adjustments to the independent suspension points, adjustments to the braking. A lot of input variables, but what makes this a high-performance vehicle is not that it's got a lot of input variables. Rather, it's a high-performance vehicle because it's got those inputs, but the driver only needs to think of a handful. All the rest is automated through intelligent processes. Fine adjustments to the braking so that the car handles well as I accelerate through a corner. That's being done for me. If I, as the driver, needed to make those adjustments, the drive would be lousy. Intelligent processes making good choices. The same thing can be done with variation axes, such as optical size. That can be automated based on other inputs to produce good typographic results without the user needing to know how to manipulate those choices. So, with a view to thinking about what are the right set of axes, I've started putting together a project on GitHub that I'll be launching shortly, which will be a forum that anybody can join to engage in a discussion, make proposals about what axes we should be using, provide feedback, and build industry consensus around what those should be. So finally, the last person at our party, she's ready for the party. She understands variable fonts, and she understands that there's still some things in process, but that's not holding her back. She's excited, she's ready to get on the train and enjoy the ride. That's kind of where we are at Microsoft. We see a lot of potential here, and we know that there's still some things that need to get worked through, but we want to move forward. And we hope that several of you will also want to hop on board and enjoy the ride. So thank you.